Hey, welcome to this live webinar. Thanks for joining on. I know some of you guys just really signed up right at the last minute, so thank you for jumping on here. We have some really important things that we'd like to share with you. Over the last few weeks, as we've been growing in the experience and our engagement in the COVID-19 crisis, we had been connecting with churches and connecting with church leaders to think through how to better understand what's going on in the way that the churches are responding in the midst of this crisis. And so before we jump into any of that data, before we jump into any of the results of that report, just want to let you know that we spent the last few weeks working with a myriad of partners and myriad of organizations to really contact churches and to find out what are they doing in these last week and a half as we've been growing in our experience in the crisis here. So what we're going to do on this webinar is we're going to talk about some of the partners that have come together to put together the data and put together the churches that were surveyed. We're going to look through some of the results of that survey, and then we're going to spend some time thinking through some of the innovative ideas that we're seeing churches on the ground doing last week and this week, some of the things that they've been doing. And then we'll spend some time at the end of the webinar to sort through some of the questions that you might have regarding this survey, but also anything else that you are seeing in the way that churches are responding to the COVID crisis. I want to introduce real quick Ed Stetzer, who is the executive director of the Billy Graham Center. He's also the co-executive director of the Ascend Institute. And Ed, why don't you share a little bit about the project, and then you can jump into some things.
Happy to do it, and thank you so much, Daniel. That voice you're listening to is Daniel Yang. He leads the Ascend Institute, and super thankful for the Ascend Institute's partnership here. Let me tell you how we got here quite briefly. Todd Wilson, you may know the name. He's the mega mind behind Exponential and, well, lots of other things. And he reached out and said, hey, we have access to some pastors. What if we did a survey? And so what we've done is we've actually created a survey of churches that we sent out to a series of mailing lists. And I'll explain that more in just a minute. By the way, let me tell you that survey is up right now. You can find that survey at the Exponential site and at the links that are provided here as well. But don't go quite yet. We want you to listen to what we're talking about here first. So let me share just a little bit about what the survey is and kind of walk through so you're somewhat more aware of what we're talking about. Again, we put this together. You can see here. It's sponsored by Ascend Institute. Exponential was kind of the initiator here. Leadership member Catalyst, discipleship.org, and ARC stands for the Association of Related Churches. And so particular thanks to the Ascend Institute. Our Ascend Institute team has been working hard, and particularly Andrew McDonald, who kind of leaned in on this to help write this report. And that's a partnership with help resourced by the North American Mission Board, through the Billy Graham Center, and Exponential, of course, key player here. We had over 1,500 responses from pastors and church leaders. And let me tell you a little bit more about that, because it's really key that when we talk about responses, we understand what we're talking about here, right? So when we talk about responses, we're not particularly talking about responses that are all in a scientifically valid manner. That's important that you track with me. This is what we call a convenience sample. So these are a group of people who were connected with Exponential or these organizations, and so those responses should be taken into account when we think about those responses. So those responses are broad, but they're also from a group of people that are probably more evangelical, they're probably more online, because this is the convenience sample. For all of your sampling that's done, that's non-convenient sample, both Exponential and the Billy Graham Center Institute, we partner with Lifeway Research. That would be more scientific and more intentional sampling, random sampling. We didn't do that, but we didn't have time. So let's look at 4 quick things. What we're seeing, you'll see this more in the report, pastors and church leaders reflect uncertainty that we are seeing in other sectors. Here's actually a graphic that tells a bit of the story. We asked them which of the following best describes your future plans for corporate worship. People are uncertain, taking things one at a time. It's interesting. Some are continuing as is. Some are talking about eventually changing. This survey was done over the last 9 or 10 days. So you see a picture that there's a lot of uncertainty in the context. We're going to come back to these things. I'm giving you a broad overview right now. Number 2, pastors are struggling to navigate the obstacles of technology-based ministry. We heard that in a very strong way. Let's take a look at some numbers. For churches that are doing online gatherings, we asked, what are you finding to be the biggest obstacle? And 51% said creating engaging interactions was a significant obstacle. So maybe they're watching on Facebook Live, YouTube. There's not some of the online church platforms where people can chat and have prayer requests. I had the privilege of sharing at City Church Chicago, which is our local Hillsong Family Church, and they had a chat where people were taking prayer requests and connecting over there. Same thing we had at Moody Church, right? We streamed live on Sunday from there. But a lot of churches don't have that capability, and we're seeing that challenge. 41% saying technology is actually a significant obstacle to what they're doing. They're having challenges with the technology. We know that some streaming platforms actually went down on Sunday, and we're so thankful for the great work they're doing, but we did know that those went down. We find that 7% are dealing with objections or criticism from congregants for using technology. Now, 7% is kind of a magic number in research because 7% of Americans believe the moon landing was faked. So whenever you see 7%, you can remember that 7% of people are always going to be upset about something, but they're still dealing with people who are unhappy that they're even engaging in this technology. Okay, so talk to number one, pastors and church leaders reflect uncertainty we're seeing in other sectors, not panicking, not at a financial free fall. We'll talk more about that in just a bit. Number two, struggling to navigate the obstacles of technology-based ministry. And number three, looking for practical help on how to do ministry in quarantine. And we're using that as a broad answer to quarantine, but it depends on where you are, right? So in Illinois, New York, lots of states we're in lockdown, some are not. We may see that change, but we really saw some beautiful examples that we share with you in the full report, which you can find. In fact, you have to tell me that. Tell me that in the chat, folks, if you can tell me where I should direct them to find the report. But again, I know it's at exponential.org. We published an article now at Christianity Today that lists it and lists to some other resources as well, but they'll tell me the exact space in just a second. Under number three, what kinds of resources do you need to lead your staff, your church staff and organization? 59% need resources to help create engaging online conversations and gatherings. And let me say, I did an interview for a podcast we've launched called Leadership in the Coronavirus Crisis. Bobby Gruenwald from Life Church talked about the availability of their platform. People are literally working 24/7 as that's scaled up quite suddenly and more. So what kind of resources people are asking for is also 53% on how to do mission and outreach. By the way, the link you can find is at exponential.org/COVID-report. Let's see if we can't, for our team, let's see if we can't find a simple link for that as well. Let's use a link shortener, something easier to find that goes to exponential.org/COVID-report, and you can find that. But we'll see if we can't find a simpler one. As you can tell, we're all moving fast here. So 53% want resources for how to do mission and outreach. If you go to coronavirusandthechurch.com is a resource we launched with Saddleback's Peace Plan, Rick Warren, the Humanitarian Disaster Institute, and the Billy Graham Center, where I am. I'm really not at the Billy Graham Center. I'm in my basement with a sheet against the wall. My guess is you knew that. But you can actually find resources there. Those are immediate needs. Number four, this I really want you not to miss, right? Here's what we found. Matter of fact, it was a surprise to us, right? Here's one of the surprises to us. 52% said finances will be tight, but they can manage by reducing expenses without too much pain. We actually found, as we looked at the full, you'll see all the answers, the options that were given, all the questions, even though this is not a random scientific sample, it's a convenience sample. We've listed all the questions, 1,500 people answered, and over 1,500. One of the surprises we came away from the report was that churches are not at this moment in an economic crisis, but they're a little anxious on what's looming on the horizon. 6% indicated that they might have to close. And don't misunderstand that this sample is a sample that would be online, that would have connected with Catalyst or discipleship.org or Exponential. We've made a new link, by the way. It's now exponential.org/COVID. Pretty simple now, exponential.org/COVID. Thanks, team, for feeding that to me. 6% indicate they might have to close. Now again, that's a pretty substantial number when you consider the sample from which we're drawing these things. Oops, jumped ahead there. Also, too, more than half of those were churches of less than 50 people. And so what I want to do is I want to turn it over to 55% of churches, by the way, are asking for content on how to navigate and survive the financial crunch. So let me turn that over to Daniel, who's going to take it from here and share a little bit about that.
Great, thanks, Ed. And just to remind you, the report is up, exponential.org/COVID. That's the shorter URL. And if you have any questions, you can start putting them in the chat feature, And towards the end of our presentation, we'll try to field some of the questions as much as possible. So Ed just spent the last couple of minutes talking through the 4 major findings, looking at how are churches experiencing the pandemic, how are they experiencing and responding to the pandemic. And I want to spend some time just sharing some of the qualitative questions that came from the survey, how churches are actually responding both and shepherding the congregation, but then also how they're evangelistically reaching out. There's tons of other suggestions and ideas on the actual full report, but I want to pull just a few for you. So how are churches responding? One church says they've established specific ministries with volunteers, coordinating leaders focused on delivering meals, supplies, medicine, etc. for those most vulnerable. So they're focused on those that are most vulnerable. That could be the elderly population, those with underlying conditions, and then also medical professional personnel. Now, I should qualify this, everything that we're saying here was given to us word for word verbatim, and I want to put a qualifier out there that you should only do what your local municipality and your state allows you to do. And so I want to make sure that that's clear, but this is what one church is doing. So they're establishing specific ministries with volunteers, and they're saying you serve the seniors, you serve that, and then they're making sure that they're being fed, that they have the medical supplies that they need, etc. Secondly, is that they're coordinating, or there's one group is coordinating phone calls to every member and attendee, either splitting up among leadership or assigned to a specific volunteer as a new ministry. And this is really important. I've actually spent the last week and a half coaching about 100 pastors, walking through creating a 90-day plan. And they're realizing that 9-10 days into this, a lot of the church members have not had a physical, personal touch. They've been watching church online. They've been engaging through Zoom or through text, but they've not had a personal phone call or a personal interaction with somebody outside of their home. And so it's encouraging to see how churches are actually trying to give a personal touch to each one of their members. This is, again, regarding people care. Some of the other things that they're doing right now is churches are even drafting letters and care packages for their members, for neighbors to hand out, to focus on exchanging cell phones, help, and prayer. This might be helpful for those states who aren't actually yet in shelter in place. We're here in Chicago, and so it's harder to be out and about. But for those of you who are in other states where you can still be out and about, these are ways where you can practically begin reaching out to those around you. And then lastly is churches are hosting daily Facebook Live, Zoom, devotional Q&As. And subjects tend to be around fear, God's sovereignty, love, or evangelism. And these are pastors that are intentionally trying to create a gathering place throughout the day where they're leading their church in prayer, where they're leading their church in scripture reading, and they're wanting to make sure that people are engaged, that people are actually beyond just kind of interacting with people in the home. They're actually hearing scripture and they're being prayed over, and you're seeing this happen all throughout Facebook and other formats. I want to talk about some notable innovations, some of the unique things that we saw. So we combed through over 1,500 surveys, went through every individual response, a team of us, and pulled out some of the things. Again, you'll see the full report with more suggestions, but these are some of the notable things that you can begin to think about. Now, if you're a denominational leader or a network leader, or you oversee churches, you should begin to be thinking right now, how do I actually reach out to my pastors and to church planters, and how do I actually help them to think in these innovative ways? One church indicated that they downscaled the production value of their weekend service. They transformed their stage into a living room to emphasize the intimacy of worship and preaching. And so instead of trying to reduplicate the worship experience on a Sunday morning, the churches are actually trying to create a living room environment in whatever they're broadcasting to their church members, so that they feel like they're in the living room or they're in the home with their church members. One group out in Virginia, actually, they launched a website for their community. If you go to covidcare757.com, this is a church-sponsored website, but they created it for their community. And so if you go to the website, it actually includes all of the up-to-date information about the COVID response in that area code. They're also mindful to talk about some of the resources that are available for marginalized community members. And also on the website, they provide scripture, prayer requests, and offers for assistance to their family or to their neighborhood and their community. One church actually came up with a really good idea, and they are delivering sanitized. Now, again, the key word there is sanitized iPads to nursing homes, quarantined from visitors so they can connect with family and church services. We didn't include it all here, but they also indicated that this was a joint project of several churches coming through and doing this together, because obviously iPads are expensive. And I don't remember the exact number, that they bought 100 iPads, sanitized them, and they delivered to the nursing homes, to those families, so that they could be in communication with their family members. And then lastly, our fourth innovation that we found that might be useful for you is providing mobile devices along with directions on how to access the streaming services and apps. So church members that have older devices that they're no longer using, they're refurbishing that, they're making sure they're clean, and then they're donating it for the purposes of other people so that they can use it and they can tune into what's going on in the body life of the church. So I just want to throw those out there. We have more out there in the full report, but these are some ways in which churches are responding and serving both people inside the church and those outside of the church. We'd love to hear from you as well in the chat feature, some of the things that you're doing.
Let me remind you that if you go to the chat feature right now, Todd Wilson has posted the full link. We're having some difficulties with the shortened link, so just go to the full link that's there in the chat. I know there's several hundred of you now joining us as well. I went ahead and posted a link to a Christianity Today article where I go through it, but if you want the full report with the graphics and all, make sure you go to the Exponential link as well. It's again, it's in the chat, but we're trying to figure out the short link for right now, and we'll get that to you in just a minute. We are going to take your questions as well in just a minute, but let me just share just a couple things that I think are really important for us to hear, right? Our survey reflected some of the angst that some of you may have seen on my Facebook Live on Monday. I think 140,000 people have viewed it, and my angst was driven by the fact that I think that a lot of churches are thinking this is the crisis. And I think part of the survey tells us why they think that, because it's not immediately impacted them, particularly for our sample, which remember was an emailed sample, an online survey. And in that sample, the convenient sample, we probably have a lot of churches that are using online giving. That's not been immediately hit. But let me tell you, 3 million people just lost their job. Economic challenges are coming. So we're going to hit this survey again. About half of them gave us permission to ask them questions again. So we're going to ask these questions again next week, track that, report it to you in partnership with Exponential, as we're doing here, and then continue to take your questions as well. So that being said, let me share with you a few more things, because one of the things I want you to hear, and I don't want you to miss, and I've said it a few times, so please forgive me for saying it again to you, is that this is not the crisis. The crisis is still a few weeks away. If you're in New York, you're not even at the crisis while we're recording this, right? The crisis is still a few weeks away. So Josh Laxton, who works with me, and assistant director of the Billy Graham Center, we put together something to help you, 4 phases to lead through the crisis. You can, let me say too, by the way, if you want to find these, we've got this, if you go to Stetzer Leadership Podcast /resources. I know we've got a lot of those coming on there. If one of you would just post that in the chat from our team, Stetzer Leadership Podcast.com /resources. We created this slide that goes through. It takes about 30 minutes for your staff to know about these 4 phases. If you find this helpful, let's take a look at them. 4 phases. Phase number 1 is the phase you should be coming out of right now. You should be moving out of phase 1. If you are still in a crisis of technology, you've got to move on. You've got to move on. There's a storm coming, and you need to be prepared for it. We need to be prepared for it. We need churches to show and share the love of Jesus well and exceptionally in this time. I wrote a USA Today article. If you wouldn't mind too, Brooks, drop my USA Today article in there as well, just so people are aware of it. If you just Google USA Today, my name and masks. Because I think that we need to live in such a way that what Eusebius said of the 4th century Christians, that they served in the midst of a pandemic that's far worse than what we're going to experience nationally. But it says that they glorified the God. He's linked it there. Thank you so much, Brooks. That ultimately they glorified the God of the Christians. They glorified the God of the Christians. Now, why? Because I want our deeds to be on everyone's lips. That's the full quote. The Christians' deeds were on everyone's lips, and they glorified the God of the Christians. Let's show and share the love of Jesus well in the midst of this crisis. Let's talk about phase 2, which you should be entering into right now. Okay, phase 2 is to prepare and plan. You need right now to be saying, what are we going to be doing with people in our congregation when they begin to get sick? I tweeted at the beginning of this week that this week someone you know is going to be diagnosed with coronavirus. And pretty much all of us can say, I know somebody. I said next month, probably in April, maybe early May, someone you know will probably die from coronavirus. Okay, now I'm not a doctor. Well, I'm a doctor. My kids say I'm the kind of doctor who doesn't help people. But I'm not a physician. I didn't sleep at a Holiday Inn Express last night. But this is what we are told by medical professionals. So this is not the crisis. The crisis is coming. You need to be preparing and planning. You say, what ways should we prepare and plan? How are you going to take care of people in your church, the one another's of Scripture? You've got people right now who are isolated. We did the podcast with Rick Warren at the podcast I mentioned earlier. He's isolated because he has a condition, a pre-existing condition. He can't go out. Well, you got lots of people in your church who are ready to help and can't get out. Get them on the phone, right? I mean, we're all, phone chains, right? We didn't use these phones back then, but we're using prayer chains and making phone calls. My next door neighbor, I went around, visited all my neighbors, used my Lysol, wipe to ring the doorbell, step back, social distance. My neighbors, they don't have internet. They say, well, she said to me, well, we don't really do the electronics. The electronics is the way she phrased it, which I loved. And I said, don't worry, we got you covered. We'll come by. We're knocking on the doors. Right now, you take care of first, the people immediate around you, right? Your community in your church and your neighbors. But then as this begins to hit, we've got significant marginalized populations. You've got a city mission in your town. This is going to burn through. You've got a homeless population. You've got kids on school lunches. Find partners to work with and programs that you may need to start. That's phase 2. You should be all in on the planning right now. Not a crisis of streaming, but an opportunity for a mission for you to show and share the love of Jesus. All right, let's go to phase 3, right? To engage and execute. You might be a week away from this in New York when the hospitals are overflowing. If you're not a New Yorker, the Javits Center, I grew up in New York, the Javits Center is kind of a big deal. And so to see that Javits Center to be turned into a hospital, right? People are still not at the full engage and execute, even with that's happening. So you want to engage and execute your plan. You should be making right now with your key volunteers and your staff, right? And then fourth and finally, we're going to come out of this. We're going to recover from this. And at the fourth and final stage, we're going to recover and reemerge. Now, we don't know how long it'll be till we can start meeting again in groups. And it may be different, right? Maine may be on lockdown and Maine may be on lockdown at the same time. Iowa may be fully not restricted. We don't know what the next few weeks hold. We know the governor of New York said they anticipate an apex or a peak in 21 days. That's a long time for a city with a large population of homeless people, poor people, marginalized communities. Chicago, we're talking about now, there was a report out that maybe in August. And the more we flatten the curve, the longer the crisis goes out, but also the more people probably will live. And so this is a very, very significant time. And we're going to recover and reemerge. Here's why. I preached this very Sunday, live streamed from Moody Church, cavernous building, 3,750 seats, all equally uncomfortable, the former Pastor Warren Wiersbe used to say. It felt quite eerie and surreal, but I remembered that Paul Rader spoke in that same room. There wasn't a streaming internet then, and the people were in the room during what's called the Spanish flu, right? The Spanish flu, which is 2 to 3 times the mortality rate of coronavirus, which actually killed small children, babies, 22-year-olds disproportionately, and then older people. I was reading the Viola magazine back then, and they were listing the students who died. And again, this is not even as bad as something that happened last century. It's bad. It's going to be bad. The Surgeon General said at the beginning of this week it's going to get bad. I think he just said of Chicago, next week it's going to get worse. But I want you to hear that we're going to recover and reemerge, right? And the Spanish flu epidemic lasted 2 years. We didn't have social distancing measures the same way. But after that, the same church I preached in Sunday, from live stream from there, after that, ultimately the good news of the gospel was preached during and was preached after. And we're going to recover and reemerge. We don't know what that'll look like. Hopefully there'll be some differences as well. And maybe we're learning, the number one podcast in leadership in the coronavirus crisis podcast, which is at StetzerLeadershipPodcast.com. The number one listened to podcast was Neil Cole. Neil Cole, many of us know, is this church expert on house churches. And I said, and what do we need to do? And he said, here's what you got to do to get to that kind of community in a short amount of time. So let me just say that when we kind of look at the moment we're in, it's confusing, it's tumultuous, some people are frightened, but the moment we're in may change. The mission we're on does not. And we've got to show and share the love of Jesus, practicing all the appropriate social distancing that we're called and told to do, that Christians didn't do in the past because they didn't know better, but we know better. So we got to love our neighbor by following county and state directives on when we can and we can't meet, right? We got to follow those things. Someone's asking if there's a link to the podcast. Just go to StetzerLeadershipPodcast.com. All the podcasts are there. We got 20 episodes. Bobby Gruenwald up today. Just talked to William Vanderblumen. We'll post that later. Many of you are asking what to do with your staff, and we talked to him about that as well. We also talked with some information about the stimulus package, which actually does have implications. 501c3s, if you're in the United States, that's the coding for a church, actually have some relief coming from that as well. So that being said, I'm going to turn it back over to Daniel, and we're going to take your questions for a while. Hopefully at this point, you kind of get a feel for some ways to lead through the crisis. We give 4 phases. We've given you some data. Big picture data, right? You've already kind of seen it, but let me just remind you of kind of the big picture data, right? The big picture data tells us that this crisis, right, is already being felt in day to day, and pastors and church leaders are making changes like they've never done before, right? Remember, 53% of those surveyed responded they're uncertain and taking things 1 week at a time. That's commendable. That's right? We're also seeing that they're trying to figure out technology and struggling with technology. And thank God for all the ministries that have helped with that. I see, I'll probably get 3 emails a day, someone offering a new webcast on how to get online, how to do small groups online. Thank you for that. Thank God for you in this very tricky time. But the reality is, as they're learning this new curve of ministry, their biggest questions are, how do we minister well? Thank God for pastors and church leaders that are asking that question. When they're hearing, who will go for us, whom shall we send? As God speaks to Isaiah in Isaiah chapter 6, they're saying, here I am, Lord, send me. So we don't know all this. The finances were, again, surprising to us, maybe encouraging, but we also think that probably in the next coming weeks, we'll see some of those greater challenges manifesting themselves. If you're online with us, I believe you can put questions in the chat. We actually have someone screening those and giving them in questions to us as well. And so we'll take a look at those. But Daniel, let me turn it back over to you. Daniel Yang leads the Send Institute, and we're thankful for all the work. You need to know how much work Daniel Yang and Andrew McDonald, who's credited in the report, and Todd Wilson, thank you for this idea, all the partners as well. We're all in this together. We're going to make much of Jesus in the midst of a broken and hurting world. Daniel, back to you.
Great. Ed, you went over the sample population over again. We had a question that came in just to help us kind of think through, the sample population. And they asked, did it include various different kinds of churches from different backgrounds, Hispanics, African Americans, Asians? So this is more about the report. Can you give a broad answer
question? Let me give the big picture of the report. The report is a convenience sample. It is not a random scientific sample. It's a convenience sample of churches and organizations connected to, I think, Todd, you can correct me and tell me if I'm wrong, but I'm adding up 5 organizations that sent this out. And thus we had over 1,500 church leaders responded. We didn't have time to get all the demographics at this point. We do want to do that in future, but we needed more permission from people. Right now, they gave us kind of answers to a 7-question survey. But those who've given us more permission, we're going to come back to, and we're going to ask more specific demographic questions. The sample, again, means they're online. I mean, they're online in the sense that they can get an email, they can fill out a survey. Not all, you'd be surprised at how many churches don't have that capability. It's an English language survey. Give you all the limitations of it. But right now, this is the best. And thanks to Exponential for even thinking about this. Todd Wilson, Megamind. This is the best snapshot we have thus far. We know, like Lifeway Research, they're talking about when to do a survey, and we'll report and celebrate that when they have a random sample. This is the best we have thus far. We're going to keep building on that in the weeks to come.
Great. Ed, where do you think in the weeks and months ahead, where do you think some of the trends are going to change? Where do you think some of these numbers might shift as we progress further into the
Great
pandemic?
question. I think that the technology question needs to be answered really soon. You don't need, when you're dealing with funerals in your community. And if you don't feel that yet, you haven't paid attention in New York, or maybe you haven't joined us in our Christ Together webinars where we talk to pastors and leaders from Spain and Italy, one of whom cried and shared with us, you've got to pay more attention to what's going on here. Now, it's not a perfect example in every way. We're not just like Italy and Spain, but we're a lot more like them than we are like Wuhan, where the government can close down a city with such methods that we just don't see here in democracy. So here's some things, if I was predicting, now again, I'm not a prophet, son of a prophet, and I work at a nonprofit organization, my old stats joke about predictions. I think you're going to see the finances begin to be impacted, because even those of us who are using online giving, I use online giving for my church, when people lose their jobs, they're not going to be doing online giving at the same level, because I mean, most of us are based on tithes, and tithes are impacted by people's income. So I think we'll see the finances. So I'm hoping that the technology change moves on. We've got to stop making this a crisis of churches streaming and having small groups, because our communities are about to experience a crisis that none of us have seen in our lifetime, not since World War II. This is a bigger deal than 9/11. And you need to turn outward. You don't make this a crisis of our church's survival. Make this a opportunity, a crisis to join Jesus on mission in your community. So I'm hoping the tech problems go down, but I do anticipate the financial problems to go up. We'll let you know probably in another week when we resurvey the sample.
Well, and there is actually a question here about why do you think some pastors are still optimistic about the finances? That was reflected in the data there.
Yeah, I want to be optimistic. You know, I've read the end of the book, Jesus Wins. So I'm always optimistic, part of my Christian faith. And pastors tend to be disproportionately optimistic. But here's what I would say. A lot of us are already on online giving, and you probably did not see a significant financial hit. Furthermore, people stepped up and have donated more. Here's what I'm guessing. You know, again, we don't know how long this unemployment will last, right? Some of the more optimistic people, we're talking weeks. Some of the less optimistic, we're talking months. But when we experience huge surges in unemployment, we do find that people who tithe obviously draw back on that. They don't have the income they used to have. However, this multiple $trillion bailout stimulus actually is providing what income had people before to certain levels and limits. So here's the thing, we don't know. And there are, right now, we're thinking about doing a podcast for helping pastors jump onto a bivocational ministry role, because there's a whole lot of need for online work and help. Pastors often know how to do that because of their work, but they may need to go online. So we don't know yet, but I think that church, here's what we found. I used to work for a national denominational office, and what we found is that churches tend to lag behind the economy. I think this is what Scott McConnell at Lifeway Research told me. If not, Scott, please forgive me, it wasn't you. Churches seem to lag behind the economy about 6 months, and national denominational offices, like you're the head of the Assemblies of God or the LCMS Lutherans or Southern Baptists, they lagged behind about a year. So it took 6 months for it to impact church and a year for it to impact things that churches give to. This is just so sharp and sudden, we don't know. But here's the deal, we'll know within a week, and we'll let you know for sure in partnership with Exponential.
Good. One question came in, and it's pertinent and helpful to me as somebody who's Asian, but they asked, what can churches do to help protect those affected by xenophobic views, specifically using phrases like the Chinese virus, those kinds of things?
Super. And again, we published an article. Mitch Kim here in our community wrote an article for us. He's of Korean descent, and he shared his concern. And I got a lot of heat over it, saying, well, this is just, geographically accurate. It's not racist to say the Spanish flu. But here's something that I think it was Alan Ye at Biola, or maybe Alan wrote the article. Maybe I'm confusing who's who. I think Alan wrote an article.
I think it was Alan. Yeah,
it was Alan. I apologize, Alan.
They both wrote an article, but I think you're referring to Alan's article.
The article's Alan. Thank you. And what Alan said, couldn't it just be courteous that if people of Chinese American descent would say, please don't use that phrase, that we might say, okay, that's all right. Now the president's actually shifted his view on that. I'm thankful that some people shared with him the concern. Here's the deal. We saw racist and xenophobic actions taking place. And as a follower of Jesus, that's unacceptable. We shouldn't tolerate it, and thus call it what it is. It's a coronavirus. It's specifically COVID-19. Call it what it is. You're making a point. And the president said he was making a point because China made a point. And I don't know. I don't let my kids make a point because somebody else made a point because someone else made a point. And I'm glad he has de-escalated that. But let's speak into our communities. Evangelicals, which most of you will be, are particularly more on the conservative side and quickly defended that. I would just say, let's just give the courtesy to our sisters and brothers in Christ and otherwise who are of Asian descent that right now, the epicenter of this it's America. We're going to call it the American virus? No. By the way, the reason it's called the Spanish flu is largely because Spain didn't have censorship rules in 1918 and 1919. Everybody else did. It was in the middle of World War I. More people died of the flu than they died in combat in World War I. But everyone just read it in Spanish newspapers. There's some people said it came from Fort Riley, Kansas. That's not probably as strong a case, but we don't know. At the end of the day, let's not give a virus an ethnicity or a racial category, and let's all lean in together and show and share the love of Jesus.
That's helpful. A lot of good questions here, so hang on with us. We're going to try to get to as many of them as possible. We're going to talk about Easter. We're going to talk about what about rural churches that have hard to reach internet access. But before we do that, here's a really good question from Nick. He asked, do you see long-term fear or at least a change in psyche on how we think about medium to large group gatherings? So maybe in general, and then also how does that affect the way that we think about the church gathering?
That's from Nick. Nick, that is the question I'm asking literally every day. I'm wondering, we do a church planning podcast. Some of you subscribe to the New Churches podcast. Daniel and I recorded some of them this morning. And we were talking about the large launch. Is the day of the large launch done? And I would say, and people are asking that, but based on past experience, people knew in the Spanish flu epidemic that when they got together, flu was transmitted. They might not have known about the way exponential transmission in novel coronaviruses work, but they knew that crowds make people sick. As a matter of fact, we actually saw the contrast between Philadelphia, which kept open, had their St. Patrick's Day parade, had a huge loss of life compared to St. Louis, which shut everything down. But so they knew that gatherings caused these things. So though it wasn't, so again, I use the example of Moody Church. Okay, it's 3,750 seats. By definition, a large gathering. People gathered during the flu and they gathered after the Spanish flu. So my guess is there might be, I don't know if you saw, we have a church here in the Chicagoland area that it's in the news right now that they have, I think it's now 50 people sick, cases spreading through the church. They didn't meet in violation of the directives, like we see some, to be blunt, some foolish pastors not following the directions of their communities. But they met, and in doing so, before that, it's already spread in their community. So I think we're going to have to sort of take that easily. And I don't think it's a question that if blank number of months from now, are we allowed to gather? The question will be, will the community tolerate our gathering? Will people wonder if we're putting them at risk if we gather? But I think ultimately all those questions were asked in the Spanish flu epidemic, and Moody Church's largest attendance was not directly after the Spanish flu epidemic, but followed those years. So, and again, keeping in mind that the Spanish flu has a mortality rate, we don't really know 100% the mortality rate, but if the current numbers hold, of 2 to 3 times what coronavirus COVID-19 has, and thus I think we want to give that some time to sort of think through on it. By the way, Todd Wilson just posted in the chat. They did Daniel Yang and he did a webinar. Daniel Yang and Ralph Moore. Many of you know Ralph's name. Ralph works with Exponential now. Started the Hope Chapel movement. Over 2,000 churches. It's one of the movements we're going to celebrate when we hopefully gather in October at Biola for the 50th anniversary celebration of the Jesus movement. But they're small unit churches all over the kind of the Pacific Rim, primarily multiple nations and countries. You'll want to watch that. So go ahead and, I know you're watching this podcast now, but if you click on that link, it won't mess up this podcast if you're watching, or this video if you're watching it in Zoom. You'll want to watch Daniel Yang and Ralph Moore's conversation. Thanks, Todd, for posting that there. Back to you, Daniel.
Yeah, great. A lot of good questions come in, and I just don't know if we'll get to them all, but thank you for keep coming in, and we'll try to group some of this up. We already talked about the 4 phases, so but Beth asked it well again. Beth, there's a link up there. that Brooks posted that will talk about the 4 phases, and Ed and Josh Laxton really fleshed that out. I really recommend that you all go through that as a church and a church leadership team. I want to get to some of the really practical ones that people are asking about. Gretchen asks, how do you feel we should be using Facebook and Instagram on a daily basis that doesn't feel pushy or self-promotional?
Yeah, I think, who was that from? Was it Cheryl?
Gretchen.
Gretchen. I'm not even close. There's an E in both of those. That's probably the only letter in common. Gretchen, thank you for asking that. I think a lot of people are asking that question right now. By the way, I just posted in the chat where you can get the resources. You can download that whole PowerPoint that Josh and I did that goes through the phases and steps. Gretchen, so I think right now, all of us got an email from every person we ever did business with in the last 20 years on the last week. And it kind of became overwhelming. But I think what's happening right now is kind of like there's sometimes seasons where they were rushed to make all these blogs, and then it's sort of winnowed down and people now listen to read a smaller number of blogs. So what I would say is, I don't really I produced a sermon for this Sunday because I know a lot of small church pastors have just been working hard. And I said, listen, if I can give a sermon to you, it's at that link, StetzerLeadershipPodcast.com/resources. I said, if I could be helped, just, here's a sermon I produced. It's generic. It's not something I did at Moody Church or High Point or anywhere else. So I want to help pastors like that. But I think what's now going to happen next is we're going to have a winnowing of electronic contact. And I think, Gretchen, I don't know if you're a staff member or what your role is in the church, but I think whatever you're leading, people will want to say, okay, great. I've heard from Craig Rochelle, and that's been awesome. And I think, it was funny because I got a text from, I would say the name, but one of the pastors of large churches in the country saying, we're like 8 to 10 times number of people streaming than come to church. And I said, yeah, because all of us are checking out what you're doing. And so, that's what all of us are doing, right? So I'm going to go see, what your church is doing. Maybe this weekend, I'm going to click and watch it, and I'm going to go watch somebody else. So what I would say is that's kind of a little sideshow. People need to hear from Gretchen. They need to hear from you. They need to hear from you in a leadership role, a staff, whatever that is. They need to hear from pastors and church leaders. They need to hear from men and women that they care about and care about them. So you'll cut through that noise. I don't know about daily things. I know some people are doing some daily like devotional updates. I think that's cool. I would just say, ask and answer the question, what do my people need? Maybe even ask them that question. And if that's a daily 10-minute kind of devotion together, it's Lent for those of us those of you in more liturgical traditions. And maybe it's, the daily office, maybe it's the going through the Book of Common Prayer, maybe it's just having a prayer time with whomever. Find what they need and just be the voice. And thank God that you can actually be the face. Let me say too, make sure that your people who don't have internet, those older neighbors of mine I mentioned, that they can join in on those things too. I hope that answers your question. Probably longer answer than I needed to, but let's keep going. That's
really helpful, Ed. You mentioned preaching, and there's a couple of questions on here about the preaching portion and the research. Can you help some pastors kind of overcome maybe the mental stumbling block that they need to provide weekly teaching right now? Because they're overwhelmed, and the pastors that I'm coaching through this, they're overwhelmed. They got to do the people work, but they also feel like they have to do a full sermon to stream on Sunday. Can you help them overcome maybe some of that mental block?
Yeah, and I'm okay that some people want, and I think it's probably true, that they need to hear your voice. Someone asked us, why are you broadcasting from Moody Church's downtown location? And, as many of you know, I talked to an administration official at the HHS White House office, and they said that broadcasting from your central location is your essential personnel. That's an essential service. And I said to them, for a lot of people, it just brings them comfort to see that we're doing it from the church. Now, you might have made a different decision. Please don't judge ours. We maintained social distance. We did all the rules. We followed the rules. But so what I would say is, right now, when we're kind of in the midst of this kind of big crisis, I think the question that people are asking, is where and how do I find hope and meaning and peace? And I think ultimately that's something that all of us can ultimately provide, maybe uniquely so, and in doing so, we can ultimately honor the Lord, and in doing so, we can I think we can serve responsibly and we can serve well. And in doing so, I think it'll make a difference in our communities and our churches. Now, here's the challenge. But you asked about the pastors doing their own sermons. So all that being said, it may be that you feel that need, and I'm good with that. I could see that, and I want to honor you in that, right? And so, but let me say this: if it helps you, and I might even do this, I'm thinking about doing this, seeing if people need this. I might do a little message like this each week. I'm pretty non-threatening. People aren't going to go, well, I'm going to listen to Ed Stetzer from now on. But the big response we got from the one we released this morning, where pastors are saying, thank you. I just didn't have time to prepare a sermon. And mine is just on John 20, 19 through 21, how Jesus sends us in this crisis. So don't feel you have to do that. You can teach your people in a lot of different ways. I would also say too, that make sure if you're streaming, make sure your presence is there. Like if you're going to show the video, we did say, hey, listen, I've been caring for many of you and we've been engaged in caring for our community. So I've had Ed Stetzer prepare this and let me have him share with you or whatever. But I would just say that right now, let's not measure our success by what's coming out of our broadcast. Let's measure our success by what's coming out into our communities as we're living on mission.
Great. Let's talk about Easter for a second here because it's coming around the corner. I actually, combing through the qualitative data, we actually saw that some liturgical traditions are actually creating like stations of the cross in the park so people can at least engage at an appropriate social distance.
Our mayor would not like that. Our mayor just said, stay out of the parks. We're shutting them down.
Yeah.
Well,
yeah.
I'm the Chicago mayor, not our mayor. I live outside Chicago.
So, but as we're thinking about, we're in the middle of Lent and we're thinking about Easter, and given some of the things that we found from this research that pastors are struggling with, technology, the uncertainty of what's happening next week, can you give us some guidelines as to how to think about Easter? How can we think about Easter this year?
Here's what I think about Easter. I think about Easter that on 2,000 years ago, there was a guy who was dead on Friday and on Sunday, not so much. And that changed everything. Now, here's the deal. For 2,000 years, we've gathered together and said, he is risen indeed. We're still going to get up and do that. We're still going in some place in the country, maybe you'll be able to do that together. I joked with my mom, my stepdad and mom are Eastern Orthodox. He's, as a matter of fact, an Antiochian Eastern Orthodox priest. And their Easter's a week later, so they got a better shot at maybe gathering together. They're a smaller church too. But for most of us, we're going to be streaming. And what I would say to you is this. Lifeway Research did research. It's about a decade old now, but still it's the most recent research we have, and found that the top 3 times people are open to an invitation to church are first during Easter, second during Christmas, third during a natural or national disaster. Can I just say to you that you ought not to solely focus on your congregation on Easter, but you might, matter of fact, I saw one church, and these are some of the ideas I think we shared in the full report, which again, I think we posted that link. Todd, do me a favor, post that link one more time so I can see it and I'll say it, because we've got the short link working now. Our apologies for that. Just know the Exponential team working super hard to get all this done, and these are a lot of moving parts. But if you'll post that again, Todd, I'll give you the exact address again. But one of the Easter ideas is actually people are maybe posting their testimonies right now, because everyone's online, right? I mean, I shouldn't say everyone, my neighbors aren't, but lots of people are online. The link, by the way, is exponential.org/COVID. And you can use that one. I'll go right to the report, exponential.org/COVID. So thanks, Todd. And so have people share their testimonies. Invite everyone to share a testimony of how God saved you and how Easter changes everything. And then link to the service that your church is broadcasting. And your pastor is going to be sure to include the good news of the gospel in that message as well. This may be, right now on the front page of Drudge, it was when I checked an hour ago, it says, is this a spiritual awakening? It links to a Wall Street Journal article. Listen, this may be the greatest evangelistic opportunity. Easter 2020 may be the greatest evangelistic opportunity in American, Canadian, and North American, maybe global history. A world unsure, with a faith that deals with life and death. Don't miss this. Jesus was dead. God resurrected him, brought him back to life. And listen, if there's a guy who was dead on Friday and back on Sunday, I'm going to go with that guy, and I'm going to have full confidence to face a pandemic or anything, because whether I live or whether I die, that's Romans 14, whether I live or whether I die, I am the Lord's. And I think that makes all the difference. I'm going to try to answer the question shorter. Daniel, I know this is just a pastoral moment for a lot of us. This matters deeply to me,
Absolutely.
but keep going. I'll be brief.
Absolutely. That's great. And we're going to continue on with two more questions here. And I'm sorry we don't get to your specific question. I'm going to try to aggregate some of these here. But there's a question here from Dan, and he's wondering, as somebody who oversees church planting, who coaches church planters, their focus is on helping these pastors.
Yeah.
But a lot of them are running on fumes. What are some advice? What are some things that you would say to them right now as they're leading leaders?
Yeah, I get it. And, we jumped all in. Daniel Yang and I launched a podcast. A team that I have with Mission Group worked all night. And, my kids, my high school daughter, senior, is not seeing graduation in her future. And, they're stressed. Now we're all together and all the time. And I love them, but I have 3 daughters. They have so many words. But anyway, and I will tell you, and maybe I'm debating sharing this, but I will, I just Tuesday or Wednesday, I just broke down and cried. I mean, I'm just like, I had just too much, and I just needed a break. And I prayed and I asked Lord's grace and strength, because we're trying to help pastors and church leaders. Now, as this person who asked the question may know, we gathered, Daniel, you and Jeff Christopherson, or your leadership, gathered the church planting leaders for dozens of denominations together and to share some best practices. People can go to, is it sendinstitute.org? Do I have the right web page?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah.
Sendinstitute.org. We usually go off the Billy Graham Center page. So that's how I know that. But sendinstitute.org, and they've been gathering what do we need to do. But here's the thing. Here's the tricky part. And I said I was going to do a short answer. Now I'm not. But Daniel, what because you and I have both planted churches, what you know is that a lot of times the churches that send us out have sent us out with their disposable income, and they're happy to help us, but now they're in crisis. So there may be financial challenges that we ultimately have to face as church planners. That's one of the reasons we're thinking about launching this webinar podcast on how to move to bivocationalism. Remember Paul, without shame, Paul said, I'm making tents sometimes, and sometimes I'm supported by the churches. And so we don't know all that's there. We're going to monitor this using the sample. And in doing so, we'll know more in the coming days.
That's good. I also want to throw 2 resources out there that Send Institute is connected with. And I'm so glad that Dan asked this question. There's a group, I think Brooks is going to post it. We're working with church multiplication partners, CPLF, Catapult, Christ Together. We've got 2 groups that we're running right now, one for denominational and network leaders. I think Brooks just posted that right now.
Yeah, it's in the chat. I see it there.
Yep. And then, so that's specifically for those like Dan, who are your leader to leaders and you're overseeing other churches and other pastors. And then there's a second group that's specifically for pastors. And it's a Monday coaching cohort. And this is all free. It all came together as a partnership of folks like us that just really wanted to love on pastors and leaders. And so it's a 6 weeks process where you come up with a 90-day plan to how to lead through this. And so we just want to bless you with that. Make sure that you see that before.
That's with the Catapult folks. wearecatapult.org, and its information is just linked right at the chat room. If you watch this later, just go to wearecatapult.org.
There we go. Last question here, Ed, before we sign off here. And this is a great question. What do you think the Lord is saying through all this? What will we learn from this? What should we be discerning in these hours? God's in control. He's sovereign.
Yeah.
What should we be discerning? What do you think he's saying?
I don't think anyone's, I've been asked a lot of questions in the last week. No one's asked that question. So I think that the Lord's teaching us a few things. First, the frailty of the human condition. We live now at a time when a moment like this is shocking. Can I tell you that your great-great-grandparents did not live in a time when this was shocking. They lived in a time when there were sicknesses. We go before the Spanish flu, and you have, the sweats in England that just started killing people. You have plagues and pandemics. And I think we've kind of grown in a place in a time when maybe life seemed a little more stable, and it's actually a little less fragile. And the Bible teaches us like a vapor. And I think that's one of the things the Lord's teaching us. I think another thing the Lord's teaching us is that churches have become a little bit more dependent on the Sunday morning gathering. And it's time for us to reconsider that. Now, here's the deal. We've had this missional conversation for 10 years, maybe 15. The emerging church thing sort of came and gone. One Thursday, everyone decided to quit being emerging church, but the missional conversation continued. And for 10 years, 15 years, people saying, you got to get outside the building. You got to be not about yourselves. Can I tell you the last 2 weeks may have done more for the missional church conversation than 15 years of books, among whom I've written some, and conversations. So I think ultimately, let me give you an example. I used to play competitive chess as a teenager, which is probably not shocking to some of you. I'm a pretty big nerd. But one of the ways you want to sharpen your game is take the queen out of the lineup. Because what inexperienced chess players do is the queen's zipping over here and is taking out the knight and zipping over here and taking out the pawn. And what happens is they don't use all the other parts. You know, the chess piece has lots of pieces, including the queen. The pawns can be significant. The knights, the rooks. Now, again, not saying that anyone's a knight, a rook, or a pawn. But here's what happens when you take out the queen and you practice. You recognize that you need all pieces on this board working. All pieces are key. Can I tell you that all parts of the body are key right now? And the Lord, in his sovereignty, has removed for many of us what might have been the queen. Well, let's get into the Sunday worship. It's all about the weekend. Listen, it's not all about the weekend. And if you've been saying it's all about the weekend, it's probably too much about you anyway. So let's make it more about God's people on mission. I think that's the second thing that we're learning. I think the third thing we're learning is that ultimately we can't serve on mission without cost. I think we've liked a comfortable world, but I think in a few weeks from now, when the worst of this crisis comes, again, this is not the crisis, there's a cost to be paid. And we see that with healthcare workers, right? We saw in Wuhan, I don't want to quote the number because I don't remember, but I think it might have been as high as 10% of the people were healthcare workers. And right now there are heroes. Well, sisters and brothers, I want pastors and church leaders to be heroes as well, because they have said, even at cost to ourselves, we're going to show and share the love of Jesus. And I would say those things together, and there might be lots more lessons, but those are three that come to mind. What a great question. I don't know who asked that, but what a great question. And I'm going to ponder more on that because I'm asking what the Lord's teaching me. Let me say one more that may be helpful to some of you. So one of the things for me is, some of you have known me, I've gained weight and I've lost weight. And I've gained weight back. And I still remember Exponential. This is a partnership with Exponential. And they had a thing once and introduced me as Ed Stetzer. I don't remember what they said, but they ended it with "and thinner." And I already started to gain back weight. And, here's the thing. In January, I actually turned to my wife and said, this is going to be a big deal. Matter of fact, I think this is going to be the biggest deal of our lifetime. And for some of you who are pastors and church leaders who have, like me, you now have a comorbidity factor. Your obesity is a comorbidity factor to the coronavirus. So in January, I said to Donna, I got to turn this around. So I've lost 40 pounds since January. I'm doing, some of you remember the Hour of Power. The Hour of Power is back. I just didn't want to tweet it, but I will. I'm actually forming a group to help pastors get healthy. I'm trying to avoid coronavirus in the spring, but the reality is it's going to swing back around. Well, we don't know for sure, but they're saying maybe it's probably swing back around. And so I want to be ready. I want to be ready for my church. I want to be ready for my wife, Donna, my kids. And so maybe that's something the Lord's at least teaching me. This body is frail. I needed to treat mine better. Maybe the Lord's saying the same thing to you. That's just 4 quick things that maybe the Lord's teaching.
Thank you, Ed. That's tremendous, and I'm sure it's ministering to a lot of people here. We're going to wrap up our webinar, and I want to thank you all again. I want to thank especially Todd Wilson, his team at Exponential, for putting this together, for having Ed and I on. I want to thank you for the work that you're doing all across North America. It really is make a difference. I want to thank Ed for the work that he's doing and the tireless days and nights that you've spent in the last few weeks. So Ed, pastoral moment for you. You just had one again. Can you pray for these pastors and leaders that are listening?
Sisters and brothers, this is our day. The world's broken. We have some knowledge of that brokenness. Can I just tell you too, for many of you, this is not the greatest crisis you've faced in the last few years. You've lost a loved one. You've been deadly sick. You've wrestled through personal pain and heartbreak. We're going to make it through this, but this is our moment to show and share the love of Jesus. And my prayer is that the end result of which will be what I said to you earlier about, Eusebius. And in Eusebius' words, just to remind you, what he said was that the Christians, because they went out and served others, right? So they went out and made a difference for the gospel. Don't make this a crisis of fear where you hide behind closed doors. Make this a moment of mission, not a crisis of fear, a moment of mission. The masks are going to come down. I hope Christians will be who they really are. Let me share with you the closing words, and then I'll pray. As a result, Eusebius wrote of these 4th century Christians, he concluded that the Christians, quote, deeds were on everyone's lips, and they glorified the God of the Christians. Let's pray. Father, I pray that you might, in your grace and goodness, give us the opportunity to say, here I am, Lord, yes. Send me, Lord, that you might, even when we're not sure and we're not aware of how we might best respond, Lord, that you might give us your grace to say, Here I am, Lord, send me. Protect us, Lord. Give us wisdom to make wise choices. Help us to follow the wisdom of our county, state, province, national leaders. But ultimately, Lord, may they be said of us when they look back a year from now. They said, that was the greatest crisis of our lifetime. But boy, those Christians followed Jesus, and he sent them on mission. Father, for those who are already sick, for those who, I know pastors whose parents are sick right now, Lord, for those who are already sick, we pray your grace and peace would be with them. We pray that you might supernaturally intervene in these situations, Lord. We pray that you might end this pandemic sooner rather than later, Lord. But most of all, Lord, I just pray that you might be with us, your Holy Spirit might fill us, and we might say, here I am, Lord, send me in Jesus' name. Amen.
Amen.